So a very warm welcome to everybody who's joining this workshop focusing on data to deal and a particular component of the data to deal pipeline that is essential, which is the coordination between energy ministries and finance ministries. My name is Mark Howells. I'm a professor at Loughborough University and Imperial College. And together with a set of brilliant panelists that we're humbled to be able to pull together for this pre-COP webinar, we'll be diving into something that's critical for the release of large-scale climate finance, whether those releases are through concessional funding through developing countries or in developed countries, and looking at how to best allocate scarce resource from the national budget. Data to deal is a sort of tagline that we've put towards an important effort in the climate compatible growth program, which is being this particular effort is being led by Vivien Foster, who I'll introduce in a minute. The goal of this effort is to help unpack what is required for countries to drive development strategies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or improve resilience in a way that accelerates growth, but importantly allows them to access finance in a way that links up the data collection to the national strategies, to the large amounts of finance that are available at the moment, through to project and policy implementation. It's been an observation that often financing is driven at the back end of the process, so folks that are developing projects, and often that occurs in a policy environment or a regulatory environment or within a set of instruments that are not necessarily the most effective. And something that has been spearheaded by a number of countries, not least of which is in Costa Rica and in Cyprus, as well as very good insight coming from Kenya, which we'll hear about in a moment, is the importance for countries to develop national strategies and then to break those up into financeable or actionable chunks, ensure there's strong and appropriate interministerial coordination, and then links together with international finance institutions, and getting this or to national treasury, and getting this information and these workflows clearly articulated, well documented, and evidence to translate those into action plans that countries can adapt and adopt in a manner that's appropriate for themselves, is something that we see as being absolutely critical. This panel is composed of some wonderful speakers, and have the privilege of calling them friends, but I also feel like a bit of an outlier, because they've all been involved in parts of this chain that are required to release funding, and they've all been involved in it in a way that's been path-breaking. So I'll introduce the speakers very quickly and then ask them to kick off with a 4 to 5 minute opening statements. So let me run through them quickly. I mentioned that Vivien Foster. Vivien's a recent member of the Climate Compatible Growth Program and joins us from the World Bank, where she was the chief economist in charge of infrastructure and developed a lot of really inspirational work that had focused on a number of things, from trying to unpack the amount of investment that is required for development in various settings where information was very scarce, through to understanding and measuring institutional capacities in countries, which again is a critical piece of this particular puzzle. Zachariadis is from the Cyprus Institute, and has been doing some groundbreaking work focusing on national development strategies. Kicking off, some of this started with thinking about how to kickstart the economy after COVID, but to do this in a way where the initiatives that were set up so that they would be in the national interest, but also reduce emissions at the same time. And this work is being used by government to understand how to apportion its funding. Jairo-Tortós is a professor at the University of Costa Rica, and we'll hear about some of the groundbreaking work that he has been involved in, where through very cleverly organized efforts, it's the case that billions of dollars of concessionary finance have been mobilized using open workflows that are effectively accessible to any country on the planet that would like to go through the same. And then Boniface Kinyanjui, Boniface is a longtime friend of mine who has been working in the Kenya Lighting and Power Company. Kenya is notable for its success as a renewable energy hub in the East Africa region, and a country that many are trying to emulate with respect to underlying planning and good practice, moving through to investment, and really smart business cases around world-leading business cases around the deployment of advanced renewables such as geothermal energy. So I'd like to pass over to our speakers. I'd like to start with Boniface, who's been involved in this pipeline for some time and leading a lot of the energy planning work in the country. And Boniface, perhaps you could let us know about the importance of moving from that very technical energy planning through to financing and interactions with the finance ministry. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited here to be a panelist on this important discussion, building bridges between ministry. Just like Mark said, I've been involved in power development planning for some time. I work for the power utility, Kenya Power and Lighting. And over the last 2 decades, I've been involved in planning, more than 2 decades now. And my observation is that the linkage between the 2 ministries, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Energy, very, very important. Looking back, I can share our experience here where we had challenges in terms of adequacy of supply and cost of electricity running on emergency power, where we had to work closely with the Ministry of Finance to be able to sustain supply and to be able to change the situation and move from the challenges to the current situation. It's been a journey, and I think these ministries need each other. As you know, energy and economic development are interrelated. The relationship is bi-directional, and they are dependent on each other. So it's very important that we are able to link, to maintain the link between the 2 ministries, and to be able to translate our plans to projects, because without this, the projects risk remaining exactly that, and not translating into projects. If I cite a quote by a former US president, planning is everything, but a plan is nothing. So you'd have to transform your plan into a project so that you can be able to realize benefits. So therefore, this is a very important link, and this is the way we'll be able to get projects done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boniface. You were well under time there, and the amount of time you spent was disproportionate to the importance of those messages, because those are just critical. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll circle back in a few minutes. Next, I'd like to hand over to Zachariadis from the Cyprus Institute. As I said earlier, in the case of Costa Rica, open workflows were developed that can be adopted by countries anywhere. Similarly, Theo and his team developed open workflows that have been instrumental at national level, but also in being able to communicate to the European Commission and position the country as well. But Theo, may I hand over to you as well for a 4 to 5 minutes opening statement, and you've got some slides there, great, which we can see. Theo.
Great, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. It's an honor always to be invited in these CCG activities because they are really exciting. Since Cyprus is a member state of the European Union, I will not focus very much on the funding needs because there are particularities for EU member states which may not be relevant for most parts of the audience. I will try to focus a little bit more on the interaction between energy and finance ministries and some reflections on our experience of that. First of all, the role of finance ministries is, of course, undisputable. One can obviously find very clear messages and justifications in the International Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, which show and try to persuade all finance ministries about their essential roles for the transition to net zero economies. But okay, these are finance ministries, they underline their importance. But I would like to highlight, for example, some recommendations that were made by a non-finance ministry related source. There is a report by the Oxford Smith School and the Swedish Energy Agency that appeared earlier this year, which underlined that the successful green transition, which is fundamentally about the future direction of the entire economy, must take a whole of government approach and should not be an issue that is reserved for environment or energy ministries. And they, among the recommendations they offer, they talk about creating a specific body, ideally at the cabinet level, or I would say as a second best under a finance ministry, with clear mandates to work across ministries. So you see that it's not only the finance ministries that try to find a role, but I think the role of finance ministries is more widely acknowledged, although it was not obvious until some years before. So some reflections on how to facilitate engagement between energy and finance ministries, since this is the topic for today. First of all, it is important for the energy ministries to understand the crucial role of finance ministries or planning or economy ministries, and to make also the finance ministries aware of this role for the, right?
Yes.
Okay, so for example, one should properly define the so-called investment gap, which would be defined something like the investments needed under a net zero scenario versus the investments that will be realized under a business as usual scenario. But it is not to be taken for granted what a business as usual scenario will look like. So sometimes there may be overestimations or underestimations of the investment gap. So this should be preferably agreed with the finance ministries. Then one should not forget the investments in enabling infrastructure, for example, grids, or the interaction between electric vehicles that may penetrate a lot in the market in the coming decades and power generation. And sometimes the investments in enabling infrastructure may be ignored in some calculations. And then the question, another relevant question, I think, is which part of these investments would require public funds and what kind of public funds? There are direct public investments in the energy system. There are government subsidies for private investments. There are loans to the private sector with public guarantees and so on. So all of this is not of the same importance, and this should be clarified as much as possible. And I think that it cannot be clarified without the involvement of finance ministries. And then the energy ministries and the analysts advising the energy ministries, I think, should consider the concerns of finance ministries. For example, if you present to a finance ministry the investments for net zero, this may cause them a shock, first of all, because there may seem to be a huge investment gap. One should illustrate the benefits of the net zero transition, the side benefits, we could say. For example, if we are talking about net energy importers, then that the lower fuel import costs may help macroeconomically and also in terms of household costs. The improved public health costs because of the improvement in air quality and so on. I'm not sure that it will always be taken very seriously by finance ministries, because these may be considered a little bit more long-term effects, and already the high investment needs may cause concern to them. We should also underline to them that the comparisons must be made not against what today's costs are, but what the costs of inaction over the coming decades may be. And this is a more proper way to compare. And it is not always to be taken for granted that finance ministries have this outlook. And then, of course, we should not underestimate, I think, the adjustment costs, the costs of the transition, the trade-offs between policies, and the uncertainties in the economic impact, especially in things related to employment, to the cost of living for households, and also to the fiscal impact. These may be more immediate concerns of the finance ministries, and I would not tend to agree with showing, win-win situations. There is not always a win-win. There are not only synergies, there are trade-offs, and we should show concern about the worries of finance ministries. So we should try to understand, and the energy ministries and people advising them should try to understand these concerns in the short, medium, and long term, and provide input to the extent possible that can assist finance ministries in their planning decisions. I will just bring as an example a qualitative assessment that we offered in the net zero study of Cyprus that we published recently. We talk about fiscal challenges, and we try to show understanding to the finance ministries that there may be negative fiscal consequences, for example, because of the gradual elimination of tax revenues from fossil fuels. But we try to underline as well that the current situation with a high dependence on fuel imports, which also may fluctuate a lot because of changes in international prices, also creates fiscal pressure. And we have as an example a very recent risk assessment of the UK Office for Budget Responsibility, which compares the fiscal risks of the net zero transition versus the fiscal risks of a situation like today, where we are subject to fluctuations in fossil fuel prices. And also on the broader macroeconomic challenges, we try to underline the positive aspects, such as the reduction of operating costs in the economy, which may free up resources for further investments and may be growth enhancing, that decoupling from fossil fuels reduces the uncertainty due to the fluctuation of prices. But at the same time, there are risks. For example, the transition globally from economies with high operating costs to economies with high initial investment costs and lower operating costs may cause inflationary pressures. So it's not win-win. And we try to provide some recommendations that are related to this. So I would say that my final word would be that energy ministries should try to understand the concerns of finance ministries. Sometimes the longer term benefits are not visible, and they may not be that much of interest to the finance ministries that may care about cost of living and inflation, for example. And we should try to be as holistic as possible in our considerations and try to understand each other. Going out of our comfort zones, all different ministries and advisors to ministries would help. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Theo. And I think the message that it's important that we're not lobbyists, but we create this balanced view is critical, especially when we are attempting to pull in financing to bridge that gap or asking for sacrifice to bridge that gap. One of the things that Costa Rica has done very successfully is to be quite clear about what that gap is and use that to help motivate for the mobilization of large quantities of concessionary finance, following a very similar approach. So Theo, thank you very much. We'll move over to Jairo to talk about that Costa Rican experience next.
Thank you, Professor Mark and colleagues. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here. It is always a pleasure to share the experience of Costa Rica, and I may end up talking a little bit about other experiences in Latin America and the Caribbean that we have also had over the last couple of years. Maybe we can start this discussion addressing why data to deal is important to mobilize funds, and maybe very briefly we can say that it does help creating capacity in countries that may not have it at the moment. So this is quite relevant to have this capacity in-house, so the local team can constantly support the hundreds or thousands of questions that may arise from different ministers, not only the Minister of Energy, but also the Minister of Finance, asking what is going to be the fiscal implications of decarbonizing the transport sector when they have a very high dependence on fossil fuel taxes. The importance of also creating scenarios with the stakeholders, the scenarios that may move away from least cost solutions, but they actually become robust scenarios in the sense that they are actually co-created with the stakeholders, that they actually capture the particularities of a country rather than the typical optimization that we carry out. How this actually then leads to transparent, auditable, reproducible, and all euphoria principles being captured in these peer-reviewed papers that can be published as well, and they are recognized by the government, that then triggered whole economy studies like the one we did with the Inter-American Development Bank in Costa Rica, that actually assesses how much is going to cost the national decarbonization plan, but also how much benefits they will provide. And then this starts triggering and delivering concessional loans. We got 380 million from IDB and AFD that actually help during COVID for green recovery aspects. Then we also receive about $300 million from World Bank to support the post-pandemic recovery. And very recently, actually about 2 weeks ago, actually you can see there, November 10th, we got this fund from CIF, Climate Investment Fund, that will help us to actually deploy more renewables in our energy system, so we can actually green it, the electricity sector, which is about 99%, but demand is growing, so we have to keep that renewability in the system. So with those slides, I'm going to start now discussing without those slides, because it is very clear for us in Costa Rica, and also something that we've been working with the Inter-American Development Bank, that is quite critical to involve Minister of Finance and the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Environment, all together working towards the development of a long-term strategy or energy strategy or whatever strategy the country is aiming to develop. The reason why this is becoming quite relevant is, first, Theo mentioned it in his presentation, there is the coalition of Minister of Finance, and actually they are eager to meet and to be compliant with the 6 Helsinki principles that were signed in 2016, by many ministers, and there are about 19 Minister of Finance at the moment that have joined the coalition of Minister of Finance, and they are actually, as I said before, eager to assess how they are compliant with those principles, which basically mobilize funds for climate, meet the capacity building in the Minister of Finance as well, because the Minister of Finance, many times they don't have the knowledge about environment, but we have to make the Minister of Finance talk to the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Energy, so they can talk to each other and they have a common language. Data to Deal basically tries to get all these ministers all together and talk to each other in the same language, to then be able to mobilize these billions of US dollars. In the case of Costa Rica, this project that we started with the Inter-American Development Bank started with investments in the order of $200,000 US dollars. During 2 years of development of this project, it then triggered about 2.6 billion US dollars of investments in concessional loans. That, as I said before, some of them were used for green recovery, after COVID. Some of them are being used to decarbonize the transport sector, which is actually half of the emissions come from the transport sector in Costa Rica. So infrastructure is being deployed, charging infrastructure is being deployed so people can actually start using more electric vehicles. We have electric buses in Costa Rica that were donated by the government of Germany. Infrastructure is actually being deployed as well for electric buses. And currently we are talking about hydrogen trucks being deployed by 2025 as a pilot project. This is all happening because there is a very strong plan, the National Decarbonization Plan, that says this is the pathway that we have to take if we aim to have net zero emission by 2050. So I'm going to stop there. So just for the sake of time, but happy to take any question.
Thank you very much indeed, Jairo. It's an inspirational example, and I think two things that come out that are important is, number one, is this is very doable. It took 2 years to develop the capacity and the engagement, but that's a relatively and a small amount of money in relative terms to get this done. It just had to be structured well. You bring out the points of the need to coordinate, ensure that there's clear information and that a holistic view is taken of this. And these are things that Vivien Foster, in particular, in her tenure at the World Bank, did for what was personally quite inspirational. And so I'd like to hand over to Vivien to talk about data to deal and how it's emerging and the importance of this sort of coordination. And Vivien, I hand over to yourself.
So I think when people talk about climate financing gaps, there's much debate about that on the global stage. They're usually thinking about historical capital flows being too small to meet the huge investment needs that have been estimated for the climate transition. But at CCG, we're currently trying to take this whole concept of climate financing gaps down to the national scale. And we think it's given that the huge surges in investment that are needed to meet climate targets by mid-century, we feel that many low and middle income countries will struggle to afford the financing that is needed to deliver on these plans. And so it's increasingly clear that efforts to support low and middle income countries in energy planning need to go beyond energy planning and actually examine the feasibility of financing those plans in the country context. In order to support countries in making this transition from energy to finance, we're currently working on a modeling tool called MinFin. MinFin offers a means of estimating country-level climate financing gaps and then simulating alternative strategies to closing those gaps. The tool is designed to facilitate dialogue between ministries of energy and ministries of finance, essentially by providing a visualization of the evolving climate financing gap over time and allowing interactive exploration of alternative strategies for closing the gaps. So I'm just going to give you a brief idea of how this works. First of all, our approach is to take the energy plan as a starting point. So, sorry, could everybody mute, please? Thank you. Could everybody mute their microphones? Thank you.
You know what? No.
So this approach involves 3 stages. In the first stage, we take the output of a conventional energy planning model and we convert it into an annual financing requirement. We do this by looking at the actual financing terms that that particular country has faced historically, which will determine then the annual financing requirement for implementing the plan. Importantly, we also look at the cost of compensating investors in fossil fuel plants that may need to be shut down prematurely in order to meet climate targets. And this is an area that's often overlooked in conventional planning exercises. Secondly, we look at the cash flows available in the sector. There can be no financing without funding. And so it's very important to look in particular at the financing situation of the power utilities, which are often the main source of cash flow in the sector, as well as any funding that may come from public investment or potentially from savings in fossil fuel expenditures that may come about as a result of the transition. Putting all of these pieces together, it's possible then to look at whether the funding available is commensurate with the financing requirements that are estimated. And if that's not the case, then there's clearly a financing gap that needs to be addressed. Our initial explorations of this approach in countries like Kenya and Morocco have demonstrated that climate financing gaps actually open up relatively quickly once countries move towards net zero investment trajectories. And so this is really a real and substantiated problem. This leaves us with two policy levers that can be used to close financing gaps. These include improving the financing conditions available, either by accessing greater volumes of concessional finance or by addressing country risk perceptions through improving the enabling environment and reducing the cost of capital. The second policy lever is to strengthen cash flows in the energy sector, a lot of which revolves around improving the financial viability of power utilities, both through improvements in operational efficiency, as well as cost recovery through tariffs. CCG has plans to further develop the MinFin model by incorporating additional modules that will allow linkages into many of the macroeconomic issues raised by Theo, including employment, the fiscal impacts, the economic benefits, and other macro and micro interlinkages. But I'd like to conclude with some final, more philosophical reflections, and really the observation that energy planners occupy a different world to financiers. They live in a world of techno-economic realities and tend to overlook the interactions with finance. So, for instance, different countries face very different costs of capital, and that will affect the cost competitiveness of deploying capital-intensive technologies like renewable energy. And this is not necessarily reflected in the way that planning is undertaken. In addition, even in a particular country, different technologies may face very different financing costs, and that will affect the choice between them and their ranking in the investment plan for any specific country. Thirdly, particularly if we're talking about low-income countries, they may face capital constraints. There may be limits to how much can actually be invested in any given year, and this may not be adequately or reflected at all in the planning process. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, planning tools do not look at the financial implications of early shutdown of fossil fuels. And for countries that are currently highly carbon intensive in their power systems, there may be significant compensation costs associated with a shift towards cleaner energy. So there's a need to bridge this philosophical gap and an importance in developing the kind of tools that will bring these two worlds together and these two institutional ambits together. Thank you.
Mark, I think you are muted, Mark.
Thank you very much, Jairo. Thank you, Vivien, for that inspirational move through the MinFin tool that is being developed, which is a part of the data to deal pipeline. I should zoom back just for a second to note that these the sort of data to deal pipeline or pipelines that are being developed in partnership, not just with the excellent panelists that we have on board here, but with a large number of international organizations, and we're very grateful for that engagement. We will attempt to take two quick rounds of panel reflections in the time that are here. If you have a question, please do type that into the chat, and I'm getting handed questions in the background. So for the first round, I'd like to ask folk if they have any immediate reflections, please do air those. But otherwise, if there are any insights you could give on one of the 4 specific questions that we have online at the moment, please feel free to do that. So what processes could facilitate engagement between ministries of energy and finances? So what sort of processes would be useful? How could we better integrate financial, fiscal, and economic dimensions into the energy modeling processes that often take place and are important? What steps are needed to go from these plans, these sort of energy or climate mitigation plans, into financing plans what is missing in that step? And then finally, what tools exist to help facilitate the conversation between ministries, whether it's energy and finance or other ministries, as well as potentially IFIs? So I'd like to ask folk to, in the same order, maybe spend no more than 2 minutes picking up the piece of this puzzle that is most intriguing. So Boniface, could I hand over to yourself first?
Thank you, Mark. Indeed, moving from investment plan to financing plan is something that can be challenging, because more often than not, planners end up sharing their plan, and there's a tendency of assuming that the plans will be implemented. But I think there's need for more stakeholder involvement, particularly presenting it to stakeholders that really have a lot of influence, and that's where the Ministry of Finance comes in. So we need the buy-in. We need to be able to come up with strategies, implementation strategies, because a lot of times you'll have a plan, but how to translate this plan into a project, we end up missing that financing strategy. We end up missing even other aspects of implementation that are very key. And so you'd see a project, an investment plan with projects remaining there for a long time, where we needed action done early enough. And this, looking at power sector projects such as large hydro projects, decisions have to be made maybe 10 years, 15 years in advance. So unless we are able to come up with plans beyond the investment plan, then that would be a challenge. We also need to do an early identification of the structure. How do you want this project to develop? Do you want to go public sector, PPP, and so forth? We need to be able to unpack that. We need governmental approvals, the processes that would be able to facilitate progression of these projects. Such processes include even AG, Attorney General's office for our country. You need to be able to have that kind of opinion so that the projects can be able to progress. So that to me, those to me are some of the key aspects that we require to be able to progress from investment to financing plan. Of course, we need to identify possible financials and the structures of financing that are possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boniface. That's incredibly useful and amplified by the fact that it comes off the back of a lot of experience with very successful project financing and implementation. Maybe we could move to Theo next for your reflections.
Yes, I think that, well, reflecting on all four questions, I would say that what would be required is closer collaboration. There may not be formal tools or formal processes that can perhaps improve energy planning so that it can integrate all dimensions of the economy that are of interest to the finance ministries. There are not necessarily, I don't know if there are tools that can facilitate dialogue. The tools, I think, is on the one hand, the urgency. If there are national energy and climate plans, NDCs, or other strategies that show the need for additional measures and additional investments, any international commitments will also push towards this urgency. And then there needs to be good collaboration, institutionalized collaboration for example, interministerial working groups, either led by the finance ministry or led by an energy or an environment ministry. But certainly there needs to be good collaboration, because I think that finance ministry people can ask questions that the energy and environment ministry people may not have thought about. So, and vice versa, of course. So this means that there could be a reconciliation of some top-down assessments of the energy models with some bottom-up questions that people from the finance ministries may be more able to ask. They may say, we have these measures, and this is something that is planned. How do these add up in comparison to your energy modeling and planning tools? And what would be additionally needed? How does this translate to some fiscal impacts, at least the first order impacts that an energy model may be able to assess to some extent? So curiosity, institutionalized collaboration is, I think, a tool, not necessarily a formal tool that could solve everything.
Thank you, Theo. That speaks very nicely to building on the point that Boniface makes about the need for this to be mandated and the need to undertake this collaboration to provide very specific insights for those investments to take place. Jairo, we note that you have to leave a little bit early, so we will give you an extra 30 seconds for your comments.
Thank you, Mark. And just going to react on a couple of points that Boniface and Theo made, but maybe we may need to step back a little bit, because, I mean, although it's very important for the Minister of Finance be aware of the potential fiscal implications, perhaps the discussion has to start with the potential benefits linked to the transition, because there are hundreds of opportunities in savings, operational costs, etc. So maybe to address those questions, difficult questions always Mark ask, what kind of language barriers? I think we need to develop tools that can translate the results from energy planning tools like osmosis that we've been using to a language that is easy to understand by the Minister of Finance. So MINFIN, the tool that is being developed, actually translates that information, that is capital costs, operational costs, transformations, and so on, into something that can be presented to the Minister of Finance. So by that, we are closing that gap, that the language barrier. Sometimes we start talking with the Minister of Finance and we're talking about electrification of the fleet, circular economy, and so on. They're like, what are you talking about? I really don't understand. How much is it going to cost? That's what they want to know. How much is it going to cost? So we need to translate all those costs that are coming out of energy models into a budget. Actually, for the Minister of Finance, is how much of my budget actually that represents. How do I have to move a budget from A activity to B activity, or from B to A? Where do I save? Where do I have to spend more? And if the balance is positive, great, we go ahead. If the balance is negative, where is the extra money coming from? So these kind of tools are really, really important. We are doing this project in Guatemala, and while we are developing the long-term strategy with very sophisticated technological models, in parallel there is a support to the Minister of Finance being supported, financially supported by the 2050 Pathways platform and the European Climate Foundation, in which we actually take all that information from the sectoral models and we put it in a very nice dashboard, so the Minister of Finance can actually understand everything that is around the costs and investments that are needed. What process to facilitate this engagement? Definitely a co-creation activities is sitting down with the Minister of Finance, the people doing the budget, people doing all the analysis with the Minister of Finance, and listening to their concerns, ideas, developing something that is easy to understand by themselves. So this is crucial, really, and engage with them as soon as possible, so they actually feel like they are developing the strategy. So when the strategy will require some funding, they will be happy because the funding is available somewhere. They do know where the money can come from, whether it is from national budget. They need to reorientate some budget, or they need to get some additional funding requests. But they will be part of this creation. The steps, well, I kind of presented a little bit in my presentation. We need this capacity building in countries. This is something that is being done in the region massively with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank, particularly. Economic fiscal issues, definitely those that Theo mentioned. I think they are really important. But again, let's start also with some positive comments to the Minister of Finance, because in my experience, if we sit down with them and say, oh, this is going to be costly and it's going to cause fiscal implications, so why do we do this? So maybe, okay, there are benefits, there are challenges, and the challenges are X, Y, Z. So this is also about tools. I think we have already talked a lot about the tools. So I'm going to stop there. I think I ran over time.
Yes, you took slightly more than the extra 30 seconds, but as always, very valuable. Thank you, Jairo. Moving on next to Vivien.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'll just comment briefly on the main questions, but then I'd like to turn to a few interesting points that are coming up in the chat. So I couldn't agree more with my colleagues in terms of the importance of the human process of interaction above and beyond any tools. When it comes to the tools, I think Jairo's point about the dashboard, the visualization, that ability to sort of translate and demystify is certainly helpful. I do wonder to what extent it's about bolting on finance tools to the end of a planning process, or whether ultimately some of the finance considerations will actually be integrated upfront into the planning. So that to me is an open question at this point, but I think both perspectives are relevant. I'd like to turn to some really interesting questions that are coming up in the chat. And Bassam Darwish, for instance, asks about the role of international financial institutions in bridging that gap between ministries of energy and finance. And I think it's a very relevant question. So a few observations about that. I think, ironically, one observes in many ways the same silos within the international financial institutions that one observes within governments, which is to say that the energy practice and the finance practice inhabit somewhat distinct worlds with distinct priorities and distinct languages. Nevertheless, at least from my experience, what I've observed over time is a rapprochement, coming together of those two practices. And there's a very simple reason for that, which is that in many low and middle income countries, an energy crisis often triggers a macro crisis, or indeed vice versa. But often it is energy that can actually, undermine macro stability just because of the scale of the liabilities involved. And I think that reality has really motivated collaboration within international finance institutions between energy and finance specialists. And we've seen that in a growing volume of development policy operations that target the energy sector particularly. And I think it's a very helpful tool, because many of the problems in the energy sector are best solved through policy reforms and are not purely a matter of investments, important as those are. So that would be my observation there. Bassam also asks, what about planning in a crisis? What use is planning in a crisis? Well, obviously, in some sense, it's not, because crisis is unanticipated. But I think we do have today excellent, robust decision-making techniques that allow us to plan for the unexpected, to expect the unexpected, and to run through many, many different possible futures and pick the plan that delivers the best world in the widest number of possible solutions. So while we can't plan for a crisis, we can certainly plan for more resilient energy systems through robust decision-making in the planning process. Finally, I'd like to turn to a question from Viola Tan, which is about, the point about, improving the funding availability in the energy sector and the difficulties that presents in terms of tariff adjustments, in terms of risks, and how country-specific those are. While I certainly agree with Viola on those 2 points, I think when it comes to tariffs, under-recovery of costs in the energy sector is quite endemic across the developing world. I guess history shows us two things. One is the desirability of just keeping tariffs adjusting regularly over time, whether it's through indexation or multi-year tariff orders, so we don't get a huge mismatch accumulating over time and provoking a big financial crisis. Smaller regular increments are easier for the population to absorb as part of a general cost of living trends. The other observation I would make is that utility subsidies are notoriously regressive. They're often very badly designed. And there can be scope for designing tariff reforms in ways that provide some kind of lifeline protection to the poorest, while ensuring that those who can pay do pay the true cost of energy services. So very challenging, but I think we have some insights about how to approach it. And finally, in terms of the risks which of course are drivers of the cost of capital and therefore drivers of the affordability of the transition plan, there's obviously well understood principles about both having regulatory frameworks in place that provide some security to investors, as well as having a solid and consistent track record in their implementation. But in many low and middle income countries, the biggest risk that investors face is the lack of creditworthiness of the power utility and its ability to pay power purchase offtake. And therefore, I think there's a very close relationship between the riskiness of the environment and this underlying issue of cost recovery and tariffs. So back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Vivien. We're now left with 3 minutes to finish the session. So I'd like to go back to our speakers for a closing statement and some thoughts. I'm reminded in particular of Churchill, who said, "Never waste a good crisis," with respect to your comments a few minutes earlier, Vivien. So two questions that come up, and maybe folk could wrap these into their final comments, is how do we ensure that we include social values in the transitions that we're planning and encouraging? We've touched on some elements of that. And then finally, how do we build the right sort of momentum? This is a big problem. It's not something that's it's something that could be put at risk if there's too much information injected into the space in one go, one would imagine. So I'll start with Boniface, then Theo, and we'll wrap up with Vivien. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think for us, I would say in terms of social, we would want to consider projects that are able to support the wider range of the stakeholders, where we pursue projects and ensure that the benefits are able to percolate, considering all possible stakeholders, beneficiaries, basically. As a closing point for me, I would want to say that it's important that we from the energy sector, find space in the national budget, find space in terms of allocation, that relationship between the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Energy. That way, we are able to move in terms of our projects. And I would have shared, if it were not for time, how we were able to move and transition to be able to have a lot of renewable energy on board. Secondly, we're facilitating private sector, because being able to catalyze private investments, to me, are very important aspects of being able to sustain that momentum and be able to make that transition as desired. Thank you.
Thank you, Boniface. And we're looking forward to engaging to understand how that transition was made into the future. Theo.
If I may come to Jacob's question on the social values and the risks of techno-economic analysis, I think that the point of involving ministries of finance is not just to look at financing and funding, but because the whole of government approach must include the Ministry of Finance, but of course has to include other parts of the government too. And some social values cannot be part of the conventional planning tools, especially in the energy sector. And that's why we need to go beyond modeling and to listen to the concerns of different parts of the government in order not to fall into the trap of the techno-economic analysis. And also on the previous question of Bassam on the long-term nature of these investments and how this can be ensured in the government decisions while governments change. This is indeed tricky. Well, some smart decisions by a government that may be forward-looking would perhaps enable and lock in, but positively lock in, some decisions of future governments. For example, if a government decides on investments in grids, then this will enable cheaper and better and higher integration of renewables at later stages. So it may become a no-brainer for a next government, even if it may not be that much environmentally interested. So some ideas may be like this. Political cost is always an issue, but this is, of course, tricky. This is the problem with democracies, but this is something that it's good to be able to tackle in the best possible way. There's not much more time to reflect on this, but thank you for the questions.
Thank you for injecting those political economy realities into that, Theo. I'll pass on to Vivien for the final comments.
Thanks very much. I'll keep it very brief. It seems to me that energy is far too fiscally and macroeconomically significant and socially significant for finance and other government ministries to overlook. But I think that the onus is on energy professionals to be able to translate and, as it were, express, quantify, sketch out the implications and the impacts of the energy sector on these other wider dimensions of the economy. And that's where I think, we need to place our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vivien, but also a very deep thank you to all of our panelists as well as the audience, many of whom are along for this journey as we unpack what data to deal means. And we're looking forward very much to engaging again in the short term in the COP coming up, but also into the future to develop plans, strategies, and insights that can be acted on by many as we look to solve this complicated problem and ensure it results in better functioning societies. So a big thank you to everybody. We'll wrap up this seminar now and look forward very much to staying in contact. Thank you.